All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. Mrs. Selma Wolf for dedicating all of the Shimon Drushels this month with immense gratitude for the refuahs from Hashem and the merit of our refuah shlema for all of those in need and the schus of our brave Israeli soldiers and the return of our hostages. To thank Leah Sol for dedicating all of the Shimon Drushels this month and the schus for refuah shlema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther for the safety of our soldiers and for the safe return of all of the hostages. Our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Mark and Shana Libovitz, in honor of their granddaughter Chava Meira Libovitz, on the occasion of her bas mitzvah. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, beautiful. And Ma'isha and Devorah Wordesheim as a schus for the neshama of the fallen IDF soldier Harel Sharvit, Hashem Yikom Damo. We help that in the merit of our Talmud Torah. The neshamas will have an aliyah and the family in nechama. We of course dedicate all of Maseches Baba Kama Le'ilui Nishmas. It's a tough crowd over here. You know what? Hey, how about move a little closer? How about that? Seriously, there's a whole new medrash up here. Plenty of open seats in the front. We dedicate all of seconds Bava Kama. Thank you, Sammy. Me too. Le'ilui Nishmas, Master Sergeant Yomi Charush, Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamos will have an aliyah and the families in nechama. You know, it comes a point where it's so emotionally overwhelming day after day to be able to have to dedicate. It's a schus to dedicate the Torah, but it's so overwhelming the karbanos and the sacrifices that Klal Yisrael is making day after day. Halavai Mirat Hashem, it should be a week of besoros tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. I will say with that, let us begin. We have a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Samich 60, and we are picking up on Nun Testament base 59b, and we are picking up at the Mishnah, not the last Mishnah, but the second to last Mishnah. But it's all right. We will Emirat Hashem make a good ground today. Really fascinating Gemara. So here we go. Hamagdish Besoch Sadei Chaver. So we'll say this actually Mishnah is reminiscent of something that we learned in the not so distant past. So again, I will say here's the case. Reuven goes in and takes his produce. Literally, Magdish means he piles his wheat. He piles his wheat in the field, in Shimon's field, Shelo B'Shus, without Shimon's permission. So this is the case we saw before of Reuven bringing in his produce into Shimon's field without Shimon's permission. And ultimately, again, so what's that? And Shimon's animal consumes Reuven's wheat. What's the halacha? Potter. So ultimately Shimon's potter, right? Why Shimon potter? Why? Because Reuven brought the produce in without permission. What happens if Shimon's animal is injured as a result of the wheat? So then Reuven's chayiv, again, which makes sense because remember, Reuven had no right. Reuven has no legal permission to be able to bring in the produce. But if Reuven brought in the produce with permission, then Rabbi say ultimately again balasa de chayiv. So if Reuven brought in the wheat with permission, and then Shimon's animal consumes the wheat, then ultimately Shimon is going to be chayiv. Incredible, says the Gemara. So Rabbi say let's analyze this a bit. Okay, says the Gemara, remember again a little bit of Chazar. We had this before. So apparently our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rebbe. Why? What does Rebbe hold? So the Gemara says, Di'ik Rebbe ha'amar ad sheyekabel alav balabayis lishmar. Remember again, we saw the sugi before. We saw a fundamental machlokas. What was our fundamental machlokas? Does permission to enter mean assumption of complete responsibility? So Rebbe was of the opinion that just because you tell someone they could come in does not mean that you are assuming full responsibility for that person. So the Gemara therefore says our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rebbe. Why? What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says that if Shimon gave Reuven permission to enter and then Shimon's animal goes in and consumes Reuven's produce, that Shimon is going to be chayiv, which sounds like again that therefore when you give someone permission to enter, that is considered to be assumption of full responsibility as well. So therefore, again, the Gemara is pointing out our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rebbe. Okay, because according to Rebbe, will say, when does assumption of responsibility come? Only when you explicitly say, I assume responsibility. So in other words, if Reuven were to come and put his, right, if Reuven were to ask permission for Shimon to enter, and Shimon says, sure, he's giving him permission to enter, so Reuven's not trespassing, but that's not assumption of responsibility. If Shimon were to say, come in, and I take full responsibility for your safety and the safety of your property, then Shimon becomes chayiv. So obviously our Mishnah says that Shimon assumes liability for Ruvain's grain as soon as Shimon says, enter. So that's not like the view of Rebbe. Amr Papa says not necessarily. This is actually a different case. Hacha benatar beidari askinan. We'll say actually over here, we're talking about Reuven goes over to Shimon, but Shimon is the watchman over a granary. Someone else's granary, right? Or it could be his own granary also, but he's the watchman over the granary. And therefore, again, Rabbi say, the gadush, ayil va'amter lechahu. So Rabbi say, since Shimon's role in this is as a watchman, and Rabbi say, what's the role of a watchman? What's the role of a watchman? To watch, right? Well said, right? Right, to watch, right? That's his job. In other words, his specific and unique responsibility is to guard. When someone like that gives you permission to enter and to put down your produce, right? Ultimately, a person like that permission, everyone agrees, comes with assumption of responsibility. So it's actually really quite interesting. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here is like this. The machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanon that we saw before was a fundamental machlokes about whether or not permission to enter means assumption of responsibility. But interestingly enough, what this Mishnah is going to introduce is that when the person giving you permission to enter is a person whose responsibility it is to guard items, and he's giving you permission to enter, and everyone will agree that included in that permission is what? Assumption of responsibility over the produce. Incredible. Next Mishnah. So I'll say we're now going to focus a little bit on ish, on fire. So what happens? If a person goes ahead, I give over fire. I give over fire in the hands of a cheresh, a shota, and a katan. Now, obviously, the unwritten part of the Mishnah is then what happens? So damage occurs. So what's the halacha? So we'll say such a person. So again, I'm pater b'dinei adam. Why am I pater b'dinei adam? I didn't do anything. I didn't cause the damage, but yet I will be chay b'dinei shemayim. Why am I chay b'dinei shemayim? Because we'll say at the end of the day, I went ahead and I did something irresponsible. So therefore, again, I'm responsible in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalach biyad pikeach. If I went ahead and I gave my fire over in the hands of a pikeach, in the hands of a capable, able person, ha-pikeach chayiv, then ultimately again the pikeach is going to be chayiv. Echad hevi es ha'ar. So we'll say, so now, okay, so therefore that second case is obviously pretty obvious. It's just really meant to create contrast, right? You go ahead, I give over the fire to a cheresh, shota, v'katan. Ultimately, again, I'm pater b'dinei adam because I didn't do the direct damage, but I'm chayiv in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I give over my fire to a pikeach. Obviously, again, he causes damage. He's responsible. Now watch this. Echad hevi es ha'ar ve'echad hevi es ha'itzim. So let's listen to this. Let's say Reuven and Shimon. Reuven brings the fire, and Shimon brings the wood. Or in other words, I should say differently, right? Reuven brings the flame, and Shimon brings the wood. So we'll say, so now, and then the fire goes out and damages. Who's chayiv? Ultimately, again, hamevi esa itzim chayiv. The guy who brought the wood is going to be chayiv. Okay. Echad hevi esa itzim ve'echad hevi esa ar. One guy brought the wood, and second guy brought the flame. Hamevi esa ar chayiv. The guy who brought the fire is chayiv. In other words, we'll say, what's the principle here? The second guy is chayiv. In other words, because the idea over here is that the actions of the first are considered to be meaningless without the actions of the second. It doesn't matter what the second guy is bringing, whether the second guy is bringing the wood or the second guy is bringing the flame. At the end of the day, it was the final action that allowed the fire to go out and damage. Therefore, liability rests with the second guy. Now what happens if another guy comes along and he blows on the fire? Right? So therefore, in that case, Hamalah bechayiv. Ultimately, again, then the blower, right? In other words, then he's going to be chayiv because he's the one who went ahead and allowed that to be a damaging force. Liv saharuach. What happens, Rabbi say, if at the end of the day they created a controlled fire and the wind came along and blew the fire, then kulan peturin. Rabbi say that's considered to be an onis. Again, we'll qualify this case, of course. That's considered to be an onis, an extenuating circumstance, and all of them will be pater. Good. So Rabbi say, let's analyze this. So now we're going to focus on the first case. Case number one in the Mishnah was, I give a flame to a cheresh shota v'katan. Right, cheresh shota v'katan then goes ahead and is irresponsible. Again, irresponsible is the wrong word. Cheresh shota v'katan they don't have what's the word? Capacity. They don't have capacity. So therefore, again, they go ahead and they do damage. So what did the Mishnah say? I'm pater b'dinei adam. In other words, in a court of law, I cannot be held liable because I didn't cause the damage. But I'm chayiv b'dinei shemayim. I'm chayiv. So it says the Ma'amrish like Shushay the Chizkiah lo shon ela shemasalo gacheles v'liba. So I will say the case. So this is actually a very interesting qualification. Reish Lakish says, when am I not chayiv b'dinei adam? When I gave him a gacheles. And I will say, what's a gacheles? A gacheles is a coal, like a flaming coal. Now, a flaming coal by itself is not capable of doing damage. A flaming coal that you fan or that you blow on, that develops into a fire and that could do damage. So Reish Lakish says, when am I pater b'dinei adam? For giving fire to a cheresh shot of a cotton, where I went ahead and I gave him a coal, because then they had to do something to transform that into a damaging force. Ava masar lo shal heves chayiv. But if I give fire, if I actually give fire, I give a flame to a cheresh shot of a cotton, I am absolutely liable. I am liable. My time, what's the reason for that? Ma'asav kagarmerlo. Because we'll say in that case, I am the one who caused the damage. In other words, delivering an actively damaging force into the hands of someone who does not have capacity. So Reish Lakish says that's considered direct damage, and you will be chayiv even b'dinei adam. So we'll say this is really fast. So one more time. Remember, we just follow the flow here. We have the statement of the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? I go ahead and give my fire into the hands of a cheresh shot of a cotton, and then again they do damage. Mishnah says, pater b'dinei adam, in a human court I will not be found liable. Chayiv b'dinei shemayim, obligated in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Reish Lakish comes along and he qualifies this, and Reish Lakish says, when is this so? If you gave him something that is not an active damaging force, you gave him a coal. What damage can you do with a coal? Not that much. If you blow on the coal, fan the coal, that's when it can become a fire. So the case there for Reish Lakish says is, I gave the cheresh shot of a cotton a coal. Then the cheresh shot of the cotton fanned it. Okay, that's the case. I'm pater b'dinei adam, because I didn't give them a direct damaging force. But I'm chayiv b'dinei shamayim. But if you give the cheresh shot of the cotton a flame, then you're absolutely liable. That's Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Afilu masar lo shal haves pater. Even if you gave the cheresh shot of a cotton a flame, you're still pater. My time, what's the reason? Tzavsa the cheresh garmalo. Ultimately, because literally tzavsa the cheresh, it literally means the grip of the cheresh shot of a cotton is what caused the damage. In other words, Rabbi saying a flame by itself is not considered to be a damaging force. A flame in the wrong set of circumstances is the damaging force. When I give over the flame, Rabbi Yochanan says, when you give over the flame to the cheresh shot of a cotton, it's not the flame that causes the damage. It's the mishandling of the flame that subsequently causes the damage. So therefore, again, so Rabbi Yochanan therefore says that halacha l'maisa, even if you give him the flame, you're not chayiv, because it's the handling of the flame by the cheresh shot of a cotton that causes the damage. Okay, so according to Rabbi Yochanan, when would you be chayiv? This is very interesting. V'lo mechayiv am sheyimsar lo. If you will be chayiv if you give the cheresh shot of a cotton what? A gavza, because the gavza are thorns, top of samech, salsa, or silsa, small pieces of dried wood, and shraga, and the candle. Now, I both say that is quite literally a combustible combination. In other words, so if I give over to the cheresh shot of a cotton thorns, which burn easily, small dried out chips of wood, which also burn easily, and a candle. So now what I've done is I've provided him with the complete recipe for disaster. So if that happens, then I'll be chayiv even b'dinei adam. But anything less than that, I'll be pater b'dinei adam and chayiv b'dinei shemayim. So we'll say very, very interesting machlokes over here as to, again, in this cheresh shot of a cotton case, when is there chayiv b'dinei adam? So again, Reish Lakish says, you give him over a flame, you're chayiv b'dinei adam. You don't give him over a flame, you'll be pater b'dinei adam, chayiv b'dinei shemayim. Rabbi Yochanan, no, you didn't give him over a flame, you're pater b'dinei adam. Only thing you'll be chayiv is if you give him the complete recipe for each aish, disaster, which is a candle, thorns, and pieces of dried wood. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, Dahu vadai maisa didei garmu. Because we'll say, if you give over the cherushot of a Rabbi Yochanan, you give him over, literally again a candle, thorns, and little chips of wood, then clearly it's your actions, meaning me the pikeach, it's my actions that is causing the subsequent damage. Incredible. Shalach bi'at pikeach ha-pikeach chayiv. I will say conversely, if you go ahead and you send the fire in the hands of the pikeach, ultimately again, the pikeach is chayiv. So I will say, so remember again, actually the next part of the Mishnah, that actually the Gemara is commenting on over here, is it then spoke about the case of Niba, where someone came along and blew on the fire. Right? So remember again, generally it's whoever impacts the fire last is the one who is responsible, right? So whether you go ahead, you bring the wood last, you bring the flame last, or you blow on it last, that's who's responsible. So it says the Gemara, both said this is just a syntax issue. Man detani liba lo mishtabish, or man detani niba lo mishtabish. So we'll say, so apparently there are two different words used for blowing. So the one who has the text of liba, he's not mistaken, and the one who says Niba is also not mistaken. Mandetani Liba lo mishtabesh. The one who says Liba is not mistaken. Why? Dichsiv belabas eish. Because Rabbi again, the Torah itself, when speaking about Zosai, is incredible. This week's parsha, right? This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu appearing to Moshe Rabbeinu in the sneh. So the Torah says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayar Malach Hashem Elav Belabas Eish Mitoch Zabosai. Reference to the parasha in yesterday's daf, right? By the Nialdos. Reference to this week's parasha in today's daf. Incredible. Listen, maybe it's a good symptom, what is Parsha Shmos all about? Parsha Shmos is all about the shibud, is all about ultimately again the enslavement of Klal Yisrael, the oppression of Klal Yisrael at the hands of another nation. That's what Parsha Shmos is. I will say, but you know what? Why is it that when we read Parsha Shmos, right, you don't see people walking around like with their hand and their head in their hands saying, we're avadim, what's going to be, right? Why don't we walk around like that when we read Parsha Shmos? Why? Because I know about Ve'era, and I know about B'Shalach. And I will say the important thing to recognize is that the story of Klal Yisrael is always the same. Every time of oppression and every time of difficulty and every time of shibud and every time of tzara is always followed by an Az Yashir Moshe Uvenei Yisrael. It's the same way that we don't get depressed when we read Parsha Shmos, even though the suffering of Klal Yisrael and Mitzrayim was absolutely unbearable. Right? Rabbi said, we know what it's like to live in a time where Jewish babies are butchered. Because it happened less than 3 months ago. We know about that. Well, Paro did the same thing. So why is it that we don't find ourselves in a national fog when we read the story of Paro? Because we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came through. And also we have to draw that same exact chizik now. That Ribono Shel Olam, the Ribono Shel Olam has come through for us in the past, and it's important for us to always hold our head high, recognizing that the whole HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the Ga'al Yisrael in the past, ultimately again will be the Goel Yisrael contemporarily now. Very important. So Balabas Eish, Uman Ditani Niba lo mishtabish, the one who says Niba ultimately is not mistaken. Why? Dichsiv Borei Niv Sfasayim. Shabbos say, so again, literally, he has created the utterances of the lips. And Shabbos say, when a person speaks, ultimately, again, they, I don't know what the right word is, they blow breath, you exhale when you speak. So that's why the lashon of niv could also be like a lashon of blowing. Okay, so just the syntax. Love saruach kulam b'turin. So Shabbos say, interesting case over here. About if the wind blows, so we'll say. So in this case over here was Ruvain brought the fire, right? And Shimon brought the wood, and then the wind blew and got everything out of control. So what's the halacha? They're pater. Says the Gemara Tanra Rabbanan li Bava liv saharuach. Now we'll say. So now listen to this. What happens if, let's say again, one of the parties, Ruvain blew on the fire, right? But then the wind went ahead and blew it out of control. So we'll say, if Ruvain's blowing was strong enough to cause the fire ultimately again to go out and damage, then Ruvain would be liable. In other words, what the Gemara is pointing out over here is, remember, here's the case. Ruvain's making a fire. You could even take Shimon out of this. The only reason Shimon was in this, Rabbi Shmuel, was, remember again, if Ruvain brought the flame and Shimon brought the wood, right, and then a wind came and blew the fire, so neither of them will be liable, right? Why? Because neither of them really engaged in a comprehensive act of damage. Each of them only did a partial act, and kind of the wind did the rest. So now we're talking about other wind cases. So let's say, watch this. Let's say Ruvain's going ahead, right? Same case. Or a different case. Ruvain's going out making a fire. Ruvain starts to blow on the fire. But then what happens? It's the wind, right? V'lib saruach. But then the wind blows and takes the fire. So is Ruvain liable or not? So the Gemara says it depends. If ultimately, again, Ruvain's blowing would have been strong enough. Would have been strong enough by itself to cause the fire to go out and do damage, then chayiv. V'im la'af pater. But if not, he'd be pater. Amai. Lehave kizora. V'ruach mesayaito. Now we're going to get to this in our Hilchos Shabbos Chabura Mir Hashem next week. Why shouldn't this be like Zorea? Now both say Zora or not Zorea. Zora. Zora is winnowing. How do you winnow? Funny you should ask. Here's how you winnow. Right? You take grain with its chaff, you throw it up in the air. And the wind does the rest. Well, not all of it, but the wind separates out a good part of the chaff, right? Because the chaff is lighter than the grain. So the wind itself just blows out the chaff. So the Gemara says, why shouldn't this be like a case of Zora? Take a look at Rashi. Lehavi kizora techayib mishum melachas Shabbos afapi sharuach mesaito shekishehu magbia hatvua berachas shekor playa. So we'll say, so what happens with Zora? With Zora, ultimately again the wind assists. So what do you see from here? You see from here that even when the wind is assisting you, ultimately again you're chayiv. If that's the case, we'll say, so we said before that ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, the wind is doing it by itself, then you're a pater. If you're doing it by yourself, then ultimately you're chai. But why? Even if you're doing it jointly with the wind, there should still be personal liability, just like there is by Shabbos. So says the Gemara. What's the case over here? Rabbi says it's incredible. What happens? Says the Gemara. The case over here is where Ruvain's blowing it from one end, and the wind blows it from the other end. So let's say, for example, Ruvain's blowing in a north direction, and the wind comes and blows it in a southern direction. So I will say, so in that case, you can't view the wind as working with Ruvain. Rather, why the wind is mamish working, literally working what? Opposite Ruvain. So in that case, then we have to see again, if Ruvain, so therefore in that case over here, if the wind clearly blows in a different direction, then Ruvain didn't do anything. The wind did everything. Rava says, Kigon, Shaliba Baruach Mesuya, Falibasa Ruach Pashen Mesuya. But the case over here could be that Ruvain was blowing together with a Ruach Mesuya, and then the opposite wind was a Ruach Shein Mesuya. But the Gemara is just trying to create cases where it becomes clear that the person's act of blowing was insignificant. Rabbi Zera Amar Kigon did Samrat Samurei. Rabbi Zera says, Samrat Samurei is an interesting case. Samrat means like the way a person goes ahead and blows on his hands when he's cold. Rashi says over here, Samrat Samurei, Lashon Ishisad Samirta, Chamimus Kolomar Shalo Nafach Mamish, Ele bin Shima, Kedera Chamechami bin Shima, so as Yadav de Ein Zeli Bui Klal. The case Rabbi says, where like, when a person is cold and they blow a little bit on their hands. So that's not like a real blowing, right? It's not done with strength. So therefore, that would be the case ultimately again when the person is really considered to be non-participatory in the act. Okay, so the Gemara goes right to the Gemara says, good. I'm sorry. Rabbi Ashi says the truth is, remember, the whole comparison is off. In general, when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, the fact that you are liable for a situation, even though the wind is helping you, right? Because we'll say that's still a chap over here, right? The Mishnah seems to say, or the Gemara seems to say, that when is there liability? There's only liability if your act of blowing was significant by itself. But if the wind really participated with you, you're not liable. So the Gemara is coming along and saying, but doesn't that contradict Hilchos Shabbos? Because Hilchos Shabbos, even if the wind actively aids you, you are chayiv. So you see that man-wind partnership does create halachic liability. So if that's true by Shabbos, why wouldn't man win a partnership work by Hilchos Nazikin, by Eish damage as well? So I'll tell you why. He says, Shabbos de Melechas Machsheves Asra Torah. Rabbi say, you're comparing apples and oranges. In Hilchos Shabbos, Rabbi say, what do you need? In Hilchos Shabbos, there is one primary piece you need to create liability, and that is premeditation. What we call Melechas Machshavas. You have to engage in a premeditated act. So therefore, again, when I go ahead and I throw up wheat into the wind, even though I am not doing the actual act of separation, the wind is doing it, but I've created a premeditated circumstance. By Shabbos, premeditation creates liability. Aval hacha grama ba'almahu ugrama b'nizakim pater. I will say by damages, it's not premeditation. By damages, what do you need? By damages, what do you need? Direct involvement. And I will say over here, when it's the wind that does the work, therefore that's not direct involvement. What do we call that? What do we call that? Grama, causation. And ultimately, again, we know grama by nizakin is pater. Causation, ultimately, again, by damages is going to be pater. Shabbos says, so just really a fascinating idea. By Shabbos, you need premeditation, and therefore, again, as long as the act is premeditated, even if halacha lamaisa, there is a level of secondary or grama involvement, you're still going to be chayiv. But lamaisa by nezikin, the only time one is liable is if there is direct involvement the entire time. Incredible. Mishnah. I'll say, here we go. By the way, I'll say we're going to see the Rambam on Eish. We're going to bring it all together, but let's first do the next Mishnah and kind of get a comprehensive halachic view. So it says the Mishnah, so we'll say a really interesting case over here. Person goes ahead, Sholeches habe'ira is the lashon of, I kindled the fire, didn't control it, it got out, it did damage. And I will say in this case, my fire got out and it got into Ruvain's field, and it damaged Ruvain's wood, or his stones, or his afar, his earth itself. Chayiv, the halacha is a chayiv. Why shenemar? Ki seitzei eish, the pasuk says if a fire will get out. Umatza kotzim, and it catches on to fire someone's thorns. V'ne'achal godish, it consumes stacked wheat, piled wheat. O hakama, or standing wheat. O asada, or a field. Shali mishalim amavir sabeira. The one who kindled the fire is obligated to go ahead and compensate the damaged party. Incredible. So we'll say, now the Gemara just asked an interesting question. So we'll say, so the pasuk by Eish, that's what we just read. Remember, let's look at it once more. The Torah says, Ki seitzei eish, I let it fire, fire gets out of control. The Torah says umatza, and then it finds, which means it damages either kotzim, right, thorns, nechal gadish, stacked wheat, kama, standing wheat, sada, field. So asks the Amarava, lamali the kasav rachmana kotzim gadish kama v'sada. Why does the pasuk have to go into all four? Why does just let the pasuk say the fire gets out and the fire does damage? Why do you have to say and the fire damaged thorns, or a stacked wheat, or a standing wheat, or a field? Why do you have to say all that? The Gemara says tzrichi. You need all of them. I'll tell you why. It's really fascinating. Gemara tzrichi. Tikasav rachmana kotzim, because had the Torah just said thorns, havamino kotzim hu dechayiv rachmana mishum deshchiach eish kabayhu ushchiach depasha. So I'll say ultimately, I would have said, you know why there's liability for thorns? Because I'll say thorns are highly flammable. And thorns are often everywhere. So if I kindle a fire, I have heightened responsibility really for what? For thorn damage. And therefore failure to prevent Ruvain's thorn damage, I'm a poshea, I'm negligent, and that's how I'm going to be chayiv. Aval godish, the lo shchiach ish kabayu. But I will say it's not so common for fire to burn stacked wheat, right? V'lo shchiach tepasha. Well, maybe there's not going to be liability for that. In other words, maybe there's only liability for the stuff that's common, like thorns, but stuff that's uncommon, like stacked wheat, then I'm not going to be liable for. First white line. Godish, and if it would have just said piled wheat, stacked wheat, Havamina Godish Chayiv Rachmana Mishum Dehefsid Merubahu. I would have thought, we'll say, why is there fire liability for stacked wheat? That's a significant loss. That's a significant loss. Aval kotzim dehefsid muat imalo. I will say thorns, so my fire burns thorns. What's the ramification of my fire burns thorns? It's a relatively minimal loss. Maybe for that I'm not held liable. Therefore the Torah has to say both. Kama lamali. Why does the Torah have to speak about standing grain? So ma kama begaloi, afkal begaloi. But say kama comes to teach you something else. So it's interesting. Thorns comes to teach me that I'm liable for things that are common damage, even if they're insignificant. Gadish comes to teach you that I'm chayiv for highly expensive things, even if they're uncommon. Kama teaches me, but I'll say that ultimately, again, just like Kama is revealed, right, is visible, so too I am chayiv for all visible damage. Rabbi, remember again, by Eish, you have this interesting exemption of Tamun. Items that are hidden, you're not liable for. Where do you learn that out from? From Kama. Just like Kama, standing grain is visible, so I'm only liable for visible damages. But according to Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. You've seen Rabbi Yehuda a couple of times already. Rabbi Yehuda holds that you are chayiv for Taman. You're chayiv ultimately, again, for, so to speak, hidden damages. So Kama Lamali, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what does he do with Kama? The rabbos call Ba'alei Koma. Both say comes to include Ba'alei Koma, livestock in trees. Even those things that stand upright. So trees, which are taller obviously, and livestock. If fire damages trees or fire damages livestock, you're going to be liable for that. V'Rabbanan, the rabbos call Ba'alei Koma Minalahu. Where did the Rabbanan know that for fire damage, you're chayiv also for animals and for trees? Nafkaluhu me o hakama. So the rabbos say, they learn out from the word o. Right? It doesn't just say hakama, rather it says again, the lashon is O hakama, right? So that O is l'rabos, is a ribui, comes to include not just standing grain, but comes to include anything that stands upright, i.e., animals and trees. Rabbi Yehuda, O mi ba'alei l'chalik. Rabbi Yehuda uses O to teach me. Rabbi say, see, you might read this passage and you might think that you're only liable for Eish if what? If the Eish damages all of these things. The O comes to say, even if it damages what? One of these things, there's also liability. Where did the Rabbana know ultimately again that you're not liable for all of these things? In other words, you don't need to damage all of these things to create liability, even one of them. Nafkaluhu me o hasada. There's another O. O hasada comes to teach you that you could ultimately be mechalik. You could distinguish. Rabbi Yehuda, I did the kasav rachmana o hakama kasav hasada. Rabbi Yehuda says that's not available for drasha. Rather, again, that's just for verse symmetry. Okay, sada lamali. We'll say, why do I need sada? Right? What does field come to teach me? Lasui lichka niro v'sichsicha avanav. Both says actually interesting. Comes to teach me that halacha l'maisa, even if the fire goes ahead and damages lichkanira means it burns the field or it singes rocks. In other words, Rabbi say burning land and singeing rocks is a lesser form of damage and a more uncommon form of damage. You might have thought that perhaps again, Eish is not chayiv for that. Kamash Wulan, Eish is chayiv even for that type of damage. I have a lichtov rachmana sada v'lo bayhanach. So we'll say if that's the case, then just write sada. In other words, we'll say if you would write sada, sada would teach me that ultimately again there is liability even if the fire goes ahead and just simply singes rocks or singes earth. If you're liable even for that basic level of damage, uncommon level of damage, then what? You're certainly chayiv for everything above it. So just write sada, and I will learn out everything else from that. To which the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why. Tzricha, because of Rachmana sada, hava amina mashe besada in mini achrina lo. But I would have thought that halacha l'maisa sada. I would have thought sada just means that which is in the field itself. That which is in the field itself. But what? Not the field itself. In other words, I would have thought that Eish liability is what's contained in the field, but what if the Eish damages the actual earth, the actual karka? I would have thought that there's not liability for that. Kamash Malan, now that I have everything else, Sada teaches me that even if fire damages the actual karka, the actual earth itself, halacha l'maaseh you are chayiv. Incredible. And let's say now some ridiculously amazing agarata. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Anu Shemar Nachmani. But somebody messaged me last night. They said you should put out on the chat that there's incredible agarata today. I said, no, on principle I'm not. I'll tell you why. Why should I have to put out a hook for people to come and learn Daf Yomi? Every single day, it's Olam Haba delivered to us in Olam Hazeh on a silver platter. What is this? What, today there's more Olam Haba? Today it's more Gishmak Olam Haba? Right? Every single day, this is Me'ein Olam Haba. Every single day for 45, 50, whatever amount of time we have. We'll say literally I get to exist on a different level. I get to detach myself from Olam Hazeh and dwell with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Malachim and the Neshamas in the Yeshiva Shal Mala. To be honest, who cares what's on the page? It's all beautiful. It's all incredible. It's all ridiculous. I'm entertained a little bit more here or there. So principled, and also I forgot to post it. So says the Gemara. But it sounded much better when I took the principled approach. So says the Gemara. This is absolutely amazing. Listen to this. Rabbi Shimon Achmani. Rabbi Yochanan. Ein paranos ba'ali olam. Ela bizman sharish sham ba'olam. Rabbi said, whenever there is suffering that comes upon the world, suffering only comes upon the world ultimately when there are Risha'im in the world. In other words, I will say that suffering comes in the world. And I want to point out, Ba'olam is lav dafka just Klal Yisrael. He's talking about, again, mankind suffering. Suffering comes into the world ultimately, again, when there are Risha'im in the world. But I will say, even though, again, suffering comes about because of Risha'im, but the first people ultimately impacted by the suffering are the tzaddikim, are the righteous. The righteous are the first ones to feel the brunt of the suffering, even though, again, it wasn't caused by them, it was caused by the wicked. Shene Emar, I will say, how do we know this? Shene Emar, Kiseitze Eish Umatza Kotzim. So I'll say this is incredible. The Gemara says, because why? The Pasuk says, when the fire will come out, of course, over here, the fire is a metaphorical allusion to suffering. Umatza Kotzim. It'll find thorns. A Masai Eish Yotza. When does the fire of suffering come out upon the world? Bizman Shekotzin Mitsuyin. When there are thorns. I will say, who are the thorns? The thorns are the wicked. The thorns are the Rishayim. But I will say, yet the first people impacted by the suffering ultimately are the righteous. Shneimar v'ne'echal gadish. I will say now, listen to this. It's actually very interesting. So the assumption is that gadish, right, the wheat, that's a reference to the righteous. So I will say, it says v'ne'echal gadish. Now v'ne'echal gadish means, and gadish was consumed. It doesn't say v'achal gadish lo ne'emar. It doesn't say, and the fire will consume the grain. Rather, it says the fire consumed, ela v'ne'echal gadish. The gadish was already consumed. Shene'echal gadish kvar. So I will say, so the way to read the pasuk in a metaphorical level is like this. Kiseitze eish. When the fire comes out. Now, why does a fire come out? Umatza kotzim. Because there are thorns to be found in the world. Because there are wicked people in this world. And despite the fact that suffering is caused by the wicked, v'ne'echal gadish. Who has it consumed first? It's consumed the righteous. I'll say a very heavy Gemara. A very heavy Gemara. Now, the shaila as to why suffering impacts the righteous first. So remember, we're going to see an approach, but we know that this is also one of the oldest questions. I just want to point out, this is actually the end of this week's parsha. It's incredible. Everything is this week's parsha. Remember how the parsha ends? I don't want to ruin the story for you. Remember how the parsha ends, right? Remember again that HaKadosh Baruch Hu conscripts Moshe Rabbeinu by the sneh. That's what we just saw before. Look at the chronology of the parasha, right? Balabas Eish. HaKadosh Baruch Hu conscripts Moshe Rabbeinu into his service by the sneh, and he tells Moshe, go to Paro and deliver a message of redemption to Paro. Set my people free. How does that go? Terribly. What ends up happening? Paro says two words: Tichbat ha'avoda. Let the work get harder. Let the work get harder. Right? You have time to think about redemption and emancipation. Let the work get harder. Let the work get harder. So I will say, so now watch this. So what does Moshe Rabbeinu say? Lama hari osala am hazeh. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Baruch Hu, why are you making innocent people suffer? It's the first time in the Chumash that we find a great person asking that question. Avraham Avinu also asked it I should say Avraham Avinu also asked it by stone, right? Avraham, you're going to wipe out stone, right? At Tzaddik and Rosh, you're going to wipe out the Tzaddikim with the Risham. So Avraham Avinu asked it. Moshe Rabbeinu asks it in a more pointed way, right? Lama hare osla amazeh. Why are you visiting suffering upon innocent people? And what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu essentially answer Moshe Rabbeinu in next week's parasha? Moshe, those who believe in me know not to ask that question. Not because it's not a good question, but because it's a question that gets to the root of how I run the world, and no one understands how I run the world. So Rabbi say, so there are certain realities that exist in this world that are a bitter pill to swallow, that are difficult for us to comprehend. But part of what our emunah demands of us is that we accept it and we move forward. Part of the beauty of Yiddishkeit, Rabbi say, is we are allowed and even encouraged to ask questions, but we also accept the fact that there are certain questions to which we do not have answers. Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks about this. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, we have Gemaras that end off with a teku. So the Rav says, you ever wonder, why does the Gemara end off with teku? Just work it through, right? There's got to be a way to get to resolution, right? So work it through. So Rabbi Soloveitchik said so beautifully, Chazal were trying to teach us that sometimes in life, you don't have answers to your questions. And I will say, you know what's amazing in the Gemara? What happens right after a teku? What happens right after a teku? Right? See, that's the power of the Jew. See, sometimes people think I have questions, and you see this, people have these overarching philosophical, theological questions, and what do? They get paralyzed. They stop. Chazal taught us, you have a teku? It's legitimate. There are a lot of tekus in life, a lot of really good questions. And what do you do after you come up with a dramatic, overwhelming question for which there is not an answer? Keep going forward. Keep going. We'll say that's what we do. So suffering comes in the world because of the wicked, and who are often the first people impacted by it? The righteous. But it's not fair. It's not fair. It doesn't make any sense. It feels wrong. Right. Let's move on. Not because the question is not good, not because the question doesn't deserve an answer, but because we accept as believing people that some questions have answers, but not ones that are readily available to us, but we will not allow the absence of an answer to paralyze us into inactivity. It's incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tani Rav Yosef, Mai dichsev va'atem lo seitzu ish me Pesach beisu haboker. Shabbos say, what's the meaning? What's the meaning of the pasuk? Do not leave your home until morning. Rabbi say, now again, this is once again, Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's incredible, right? So we'll say, so this is by the night of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the night of Makas Bechoros. Do not leave the home until morning. So Kevan Shnita, why? Now we'll say, now why is that? Remember, who was roaming the streets of Egypt the night of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the night of Pesach? Who was roaming? The Malach HaMaves. He was killing every firstborn. So why can't Klal Yisrael leave? I'll tell you why. Kevan Shnitan Rishus Lamashchis Eino Mafchin Bein Tzadik LeRishaim. Because Rabbi say, this is incredible. And again, when the destructive forces are let out, when the destructive forces are released, the destructive forces wreak havoc everywhere. And they do not distinguish between a tzaddik and a rasha. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Klal Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, stay indoors. Makas Bechoros, the destructive forces have been unleashed. Ultimately, again, they destroy everything in their path. Below old, not only that, both say not only that, but sometimes the destructive forces actually start with the righteous people first. Shneimar, v'chresi mimcha tzadik v'rasha. So the Gemara says, Bachi Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef cried when he read this Gemara. It was so overwhelming. He says, Kule hai, nami la'in domen. I don't understand. What does this mean? What does this mean? Is being a tzaddik worth nothing? Is being a tzaddik just like an irrelevant thing? That tzaddikim are just destroyed with everyone else? So we'll say now two Gemaras, right? That ultimately suffering comes upon the world because of the wicked, but yet it starts with the righteous first. And now second Gemara, when the destructive forces are unleashed, they destroy anyone, and often they start with the tzaddikim. So Rav Yosef says, so tzaddikim are nothing? Tzaddikim are worthless, that they're swept away with everything, with all the wickedness in the world. Rabbi says it's incredible. Amalei Abaye, tivusu legabayu. Sometimes it's a bracha for the tzaddik to be swept away first. Dichsev ki mipnei hara'a nesav tzaddik. Rabbi say, what's the benefit to the tzaddik? Rabbi say, very heavy gemaras. What's the benefit to the tzaddik? Rashi says, tivusahu shelo yiru b'ra'a ha'asida lavo. This way, the tzaddik does not have to see the misfortune that is going to befall Klal Yisrael in subsequent suffering. Sometimes the chesed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for the righteous is that He allows them, so to speak, to exit the stage before the full scope of Jewish suffering sets in. And therefore, again, the tzaddik doesn't have to see. There's a chesed, sometimes even in the destruction. I will say overwhelming. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rav. The Olam, I don't know what happened today with our timing. I'm just not sure. I think it was all the questions. You see, Chavra, this is why I don't take questions, right? So Gemara says as follows: The Olam ikanis adam mechitov. I will say a person should always enter. It's okay. We're going to start 4:30 tomorrow morning. The Olam ikanis adam mechitov. I will say another incredible Gemara. Another incredible Gemara. Person should always enter in. I will say now what this is talking about over here is when traveling. So whether you should always enter your lodgings and not leave your lodgings b'chitov. In other words, when it's light outside, right? Check into your lodge. So to say, in other words, stop your travels, whether you're going home or you're going into an inn. So ultimately, a person should enter into wherever he's staying b'chitov while the light is still out, and ultimately they shouldn't embark upon his journey until the light is out as well. The Gemara says, "La'olam ikanis adam b'chitov yetzi b'chitov." Shneimar v'atem lo seitzu ish mi pesach beiso ad boker. Do not leave your home until the morning. Look at Rashi b'chitov. Ba'ot chamazorachos yolin b'malon. While ultimately again the sun is still out, check into your hotel. V'lo yamtin ad shetachshach u'leboker lo yashkim lateis ad shiyair kitov lishna ma'al yahar kitov. Let's say now again, where do you get kitov? Remember the first kitov we find in the Torah. Vayar lakim esa'ar kitov. He saw the light that it was good. So a person should check into their lodgings b'chitov, and ultimately again should leave their lodgings b'chitov. Tana Abanon. Abbas, I think we're gonna. So if it's okay, Abbas, say I'm not gonna give you homework. We'll catch up. It's a short daf, and I don't know, whatever. Bav Metzia, I don't know, whatever. All right, so I'll say these Gemaras are too good to just maybe just do one more line, and then we'll start for the day. Turn on Banan, Dever Be'ir. We're going to stop over here. No, I don't want. Let's say so. Tomorrow morning we'll start 5:45. Again, we'll get in a full hour. We'll catch up. But these Gemaras, they're gold. They're too good. I'm sorry. I feel like I failed you today by only getting on to Amud Beis. But Emirat Hashem, I'll redeem myself tomorrow. I'll say shkayach. A wonderful day, and of course a happy New Year. Breakfast, and shir Emirat Hashem in the Beis Medrash. Shkayach, everyone. It's true. Good on Yomi share. How are you?
The line that you said about